transcript.
Got it.
So I think it's enabled. Okay, so hello everyone to the next N3AS seminar. And today the speaker is Kelsey Lund, who is a grad student at NC State, but also spent some time at Los Alamos. So Kelsey will tell us about effects of nuclear uncertainties on our process observables. So please go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction and for being able to be here today. As the title indicates, a lot of my work that I do focuses on our process and kind of how to simulate that and how to get the most out of any single R process event. So just for a little bit of background, again, so nucleosynthesis, the focus of my work tends to be on stuff that happens after stars have done all of they can by fusion processes. So I look at neutron capture reactions. When we talk about neutron captures, what we're really talking about are competitions of N-gamma, gamma-N reactions, as well as beta decays. So beta decays are a really good way to increase your atomic number, which is great if you want to make heavy elements and not just heavier isotopes. So imagine you're in this environment where you have some neutron scarcity, which is really what you would expect, considering that neutrons by themselves are not stable. What you're going to be able to do is, actually, let me see if I can turn on this little laser pointer. Can you see that? Awesome. Okay, so what you're going to do is, if you're going to capture only a couple neutrons at a time, is you're going to be confined to this valley of stability, and really you're going to only be able to make things up about as heavy as lead. If you try to go beyond that, what's going to happen is you're going to encounter this region that is very unstable to alpha decay. So if you want to, say, for example, make the actinides, a few of which I have highlighted here, the reason I highlight these is because they have they decay on timescales of larger than a year, some of them on millions or even billions of years. So even though no actinides are stable, there's still a very long-lived population that we observe in the universe. So if you want to just capture a couple neutrons at a time, you're really not going to be able to bridge this gap to be able to produce the actinide abundances that we see in the universe. And everything just kind of falls back to lead, or to this, lead-ish region. All right, so simple solution, capture a bunch of neutrons before beta decay can occur. So in order to do this, you of course need a very explosive environment, again, where you're kind of transiently producing neutrons, very high neutron to seed ratio, such that your neutron capture time scale is much shorter than your beta decay time scale. And usually this is indicated with the YE, so the electron fraction, that just indicates that you have this excess or a large abundance of free neutrons. And then that way, when your beta decay path starts, instead of decaying towards a region where you're highly unstable and just decay back to lead, you're able to actually populate these high Z actinides. So that's the basic idea. So of course the question is exactly what conditions do you need to be able to produce an R process that will explain the natural abundances, and where exactly can you find these conditions? And then one other thing that I'm going to talk about is the really cool way that we have of using observation of actinide abundances in things like metal core stars to be able to measure time on these very large cosmic timescales. So I'll talk more about that later. And then finally, kind of one of the interesting things, or the focus on my part, is actinide production, but really the actinides are just one group of elements that are made by the R process. In total, we're actually talking about half of the material in the universe that's heavier than iron. So it's worth looking into. All right, so I raised the question of where you actually get these right conditions to undergo an R process. Again, this has been the subject of debate for decades. The case was made for neutron star mergers back in 2017 with the electromagnetic transient that accompanied the gravitational wave event, GW170817. That was the merger of two neutron stars. And what I have here is a kind of evolution of the spectral luminosity over a couple days. And the big piece of evidence here is this kind of more slowly decaying red, red being higher wavelength component that is much more slowly evolving than this very bright blue early time signal. And what this really indicates is the presence of lanthanides, and it really supports this idea of an explosive transient that is powered by the radioactive decay of material that's synthesized through the R process. All right, so at this point, most modern models will predict more than one site within a merger event where the R process can occur with more or less success. And the time scale and the geometry of that success depends on the components of the merger itself. So I borrowed this figure, which kind of highlights some of the different scenarios that you can get. If you start with 2 neutron stars, you can either have, a prompt collapse to a black hole, or you can have a slightly longer lived kind of central engine remnant. And the difference between these two, now both cases, you would expect some tidal eject or dynamical ejecta that's going to pretty robustly produce the R process, while this polar ejecta is going to be less successful at doing so. And the difference occurs in basically the disk wind that occurs at a slightly later time scale, and whether you have neutrino interactions that are driving the YE up enough to kind of kill your R process. Now, on the other hand, you could have a neutron star in a black hole, in which case you get a prompt collapse to a black hole, only one tidal tail, and then presumably you would have a lack of neutrino interactions in the disk, and so you would have a fairly robust R process in the disk wind. All right, so the R process is this set of nuclear processes that occur in this, environment. My approach to this problem for this particular project is to approach it from the nuclear kind of side of things. So I'm going to look at some sources of nuclear uncertainty and how they can affect things like the nuclear energy generation, which again is powering this transient that we see, how that propagates into a light curve, and then I'm going to make some abundance predictions to be able to do some fun cosmochronometry. All right, so all of this is a very complex set of different questions. No current model is going to fully capture all of the physics. So usually what we try to do is isolate some source of uncertainty and kind of go from there and look at that more closely. So what I'm doing here is, in order to vary the kind of astrophysical conditions, if you will, so where all of this R process is happening, is I take a number of single YE trajectories. So as I showed in the figure before, right, we have these different expectations of polar versus equatorial outflow that's going to contain more or less neutron-rich material. And so the idea here is to kind of sample a distribution to be able to probe a variety of conditions. And so I do this in different ways. Each of the different colors is going to correspond to some average YE that just comes from the weighting of the different individual calculations. And so I kind of want to highlight that one of the reasons that we're so dependent on nuclear theory really is because the entire R process is occurring very far from where we have measured data. And so just the entire process is subject to unmeasured quantities. All right, so we know that fission can be important. Again, we're making very heavy material when we do the R process. So one of the things that we take into account is what we can fission into. So one kind of extreme way of looking at it is that you can have an even 50-50 split. So your parent nucleus is splitting into 2 equal or roughly equal daughter products. The other side of that is this double Gaussian distribution, an example of which I show here, where you're kind of spreading out your daughter product distributions a little bit more. So we consider both. But as I mentioned before, you can't talk about the R process without talking about beta decays. And so the kind of focus of this project was to really look at how different beta decay rates can affect the different R process observables. So here I have 3 of the different beta decay or sets of beta decay rates that we use, and they all have slightly different methods of being calculated. I show here the ratio of the rate, or the logarithmic ratio of the rates compared to the Muller 2003 calculation. And what you can kind of take away from this, generally speaking, is that we're going to talk about generally slower rates on one end and then generally faster rates on another end. And we're going to look at where these differences really pop up. All right, so in all of this, what I can do is I can take all of my inputs, put them together, run them through PRISM, this nucleosynthesis code developed here at Los Alamos and at Notre Dame. And out of this, what I can get is abundance information, both kind of at the end of the calculation, but also throughout the simulation as a function of time, and as well as how that's changing. And so I can put this together, and then I can do all of my calculations and answer pretty much any question I might have about what's going on in this merger environment. All right, so let me talk about some nuclear heating. So one of the things to take into consideration is that what PRISM outputs is just kind of a change in abundance as a function of time. What that does not take into account is the fact that different reaction products are going to thermalize and interact with the ejecta in a different way. And so we want to take that into account and how that changes as a function of time. So when I talk about heating in my calculations, what I'm talking about really is this kind of total effective heating, which is a sum over beta decays, alpha decays, fission processes, and taking into account this thermalization efficiency and how that changes with a function of time, as well as just your kind of raw heating, which is going to be your Q value times your flow. And then all of that in some context to get a realistic number. All right, so this is kind of an output. So what I have here in each of these panels is going to be the total heating or the different expectations of the total heating from all of the different trajectories and combinations of trajectories that I showed you before. And each column here or set of three figures is going to be from a different set of beta decay rates. And the different colors, remember that they're going to correspond to kind of more or less low YE or high YE weighted combinations. So the brown is going to be kind of more low YE, so you're more neutron rich. And the blue is going to be more high YE material, so you're kind of more on the neutron poor side of things. And so what we can take away from this is that we can separate out our heating into, you know, all of the different reactions and look at how these differences in beta decay rates propagate through to the different expectations of how the heating evolves. And what we see is that generally speaking, it's safe to say that the early heating is dominated by beta decay. We can see that in how the colored lines tend to overlap with the gray lines, which again is the total heating. However, what we do see is that the total heating is incomplete without the fission and alpha decay, even though these don't necessarily determine the full extent of the total heating. Now, what's interesting is that while these kind of look the same at first glance, if you look a little bit carefully, you see that the kind of time at which the beta decay ceases to be a complete description of the total heating varies depending on your beta decay rate, occurring later with the kind of more, the slower, or I'm sorry, the kind of generally faster Marketing rates and occurring earlier with the more, you know, generally slower NA rates. So, but then the question is this observable? Is this something that we can actually see? And in order to do this, we propagate through our heating calculations through to a light curve, because when, you know, astronomers aren't going to look at nuclear heating, they're going to see a light curve, some luminosity. And the way that we do this is the shell model, where what we do is we evolve the energy evolution, we evolve the energy of each of the shells through, you know, out to some number of days, 40 or 50 days. And the way that we do this is we take into account this effective heating. So this is the nuclear heating that I showed in the previous slide. We account for some adiabatic expansion, and then we have this luminosity term. This luminosity term itself is going to depend on two timescales. One is the diffusion timescale. Again, we're in a very high opacity region. And then the other is going to be the light crossing timescale, just taking into account that light travels at a finite speed. And then ultimately, this last term is what we're plotting and what we're looking at. Okay, so broadly speaking, yes, it does make a difference. So there are a couple of things that stand out immediately. One is that generally we get consistent light curve shapes. That's really great. We don't get, you know, individual features that come from having some different weighting of high YE material or low YE material. However, we do see that the sensitivity to the beta decay, which we can see in each of the different columns, the peak luminosity is sensitive to both how much low YE or high YE material you have, so what your trajectory is made out of, but also to the beta decay rate. So we see different times at which your peak luminosity is occurring, as well as the just the magnitude of that luminosity. So we see these differences. And then also we see kind of these differences in the late time behavior, and those are propagated through from the heating. So the problem is that when you combine multiple different trajectories, it's really hard to pick out individual effects from individual nuclei or, you know, specific nuclear physics effects. So in order to do that, I kind of build this extended data set. And the purpose of this is to kind of probe individual physics effects that might be, you know, making a difference. So before I showed these linear combinations that, you know, correspond to some average YE, we can just take the individual trajectories and look at those. And the way that these were selected was to kind of probe different physics. So the idea with the YE of 0.02 is that we know that this is a condition in which we get lots of fission and lots of fission cycling. And we know that fission can be pretty impactful in terms of energy deposition. With the 0.18, we're still getting fission. It's going to be a little bit more sensitive to kind of the nuclear physics. We're also getting contributions from alpha decay. That'll be pretty interesting. And then the 0.21 is selected because you're still making an R process, but fission is significantly reduced in its impact. So that's what the idea is behind probing these single trajectory cases. And that's kind of what I'm going to go into a little bit next. So one of the things that we vary is the mass model. This is going to, affect the timescales on which these species decay, as well as the energy that actually comes out of each individual decay. So we have a couple of different mass models here that I've selected, and then in the bottom, when appropriate, we're able to pair it with the appropriate fission barrier height. And so these are listed here at the bottom. As I mentioned before, fission is something that we care about, so we want to try to be, careful with it and get as much information as we can. I will also note that PRISM has this really nice functionality that you can override data. So where we do have experimental data, we overwrite it. So really, we are subject to theory when there is no experimental data. Okay, so now this is kind of the same idea as the figure before. I'm showing the heating, except here now I have kind of larger bands. And the idea is that each of these bands, each of the different colored bands corresponds to a different set of beta decay rates. And when you see overlap, that means that there tends to be more agreement with the different mass models. This column is for single YE, the case of the YE of 0.02. And then I'm showing here, this is on a log scale now, the time in days. And so in the top kind of row, I have the beta decay, spontaneous fission, and alpha decay. And again, I've shown the total heating with the kind of dotted lines with each color. And this is really to just kind of guide the eye to see that, when you have this YE of 0.02, you're in conditions where your total heating is largely dictated by the evolution of spontaneous fission heating. And this is, likely to do, you can see different features, and this is all sensitive to the different mass models as well as the different beta decay rates. If I increase the YE to 0.18, we see that the spontaneous fission no longer fully describes the total heating, but now, especially at a time scale between 1 and 10 days, which is kind of when we care about energy evolution for the light curve, we tend to see more of a contribution from alpha decay. Still, in this case, beta decay is not necessarily just dictating the upper limit of the heating. And so we see kind of more competition. So it gets really interesting. And we still see kind of the late time evolution is dominated by the spontaneous fission evolution. Now, if I increase the YE even more to 0.21, again, we already expect that the spontaneous fission or the fission heating in general is going to be less impactful, less important. And we do see that generally there's more overlap, that the total heating tends to be set by beta decay. And in some cases, you get some contribution from alpha decay, evolving or dictating the shape of the total heating. However, funny enough, the changing the beta decay rates doesn't actually have that much effect on the beta decay heating specifically. And you can see that by just the fact that, these bands are pretty narrow and they generally overlap. So that's kind of interesting. Again, we can ask the question, is this even observable? And in this case, we actually see a much larger difference in the light curve. So we did the same treatment as before, where we propagated these heating calculations through to the light curve. These are the same kind of bands, but the different colors are going to correspond to the different beta decay rates. Overlap is good. Large bands are not necessarily good because they show some sensitivity to our nuclear uncertainties. And one of the striking things here is not just that you get, significantly brighter light curves, but you get differently shaped light curves too. Right? There are features here that stand out, and these are going to be coming from like the specific individual nuclei and the competition of different processes. So all of this is just to say that the magnitude and the structure of the heating, the different processes that are competing in the heating, do indeed propagate through to the light curve. Okay, so I promised before that I would talk about some cosmochronometry, and to do that I need to go into a little bit of background, just some definitions. So in order to do this, we use metal core stars, and these are defined as having an iron to hydrogen ratio that's 100 times smaller than what we see in the sun. Within this category of metal poor stars, there exists another category that are R2 stars, and these are R process enhanced that have a europium to iron content 10 times larger than what we see in the sun. So these are very metal poor. They have a very low metallicity, but a very high R process content. If I go even further, I can take these R2 stars and classify them by their actinide content. You can do this in different ways. The definition that I kind of settled on is the thorium to dysprosium definition. So what I did was I went through and I made a selection of stars, of R process enhanced stars, ordered them here by their actinide, increasing actinide content as you go down. And the reason that I selected these is because they have these nice uranium measurements, which is something there aren't that many that have them. And it's a fairly difficult observation to make. All right, so now we can do some kind of nuclear physics with a very basic initial assumption that since the R process is a very rare event, we can take each star to have been enriched by some single R process event. If we take that to be true, and our basic nuclear physics and decay, we can extract a time. So if we observe some thorium to europium, not uranium, or uranium to thorium, we can measure these with spectral observations of the stars. And if we know what the initial production value was, then we can just use nuclear decay and calculate a time. I will note that we're using very specific isotopes of thorium and uranium that are the longest lived ones. Okay, how do you get an initial abundance? Well, the final abundance of the neutron star merger simulation can be taken as the initial R process enrichment event or abundance. And so we can do them, we can calculate our times. Great. The problem is that it's really hard to get the lanthanide and actinide ratios to actually agree. So you can, if you use, for example, the uranium to thorium measurement, you get a very small error bar, which makes sense, right? If you're making the actinides, those tend to be produced kind of concomitantly, and there's not going to be that much difference. But if you start to look at, actinide to lanthanide ratios, you start to get these very large discrepancies. Now, the problem is that aside from the single enrichment event, these equations make no assumptions about anything else, any conditions. So these T's that you calculate should be exactly the same. From this figure, you can see that they're not. They are not straight lines of connecting 3 points, and they depend on the beta decays. So yes, it is hard to get the lanthanide and actinide ratios to agree, but we're going to do it anyway. And the way that we do this is we kind of force the condition that these values have to agree, and we use the freedom given to us by the error bars from the observations themselves. And so what I have here is, again, if I can remind you of these different colors corresponding to the different YEs, these are for the combined trajectories. What we can do is we can actually move around in this uncertainty space depending on our fission yield, and then for each of the different stars, what I have is basically the trajectories for which I can get this agreement. An agreement here means that all three time calculations are predicting the same value. And so this is where we're able to do it, and some interesting things pop up. One is that we're able to make predictions for all of the stars, but not necessarily with all of the beta decay rates. Again, this increasing x-axis is increasing, actinide content. So this is the most actinide boost star. This is the most actinide deficient star. So what do we see is that, this color are the Marketing calculations. This is corresponding to a previous figure. What we see is that, if you have too much low YE material, you overproducing, or you're not accurately producing the right abundance pattern to be able to match observations. What you see for the more actinide rich stars is that, for example, if you take the Ney rates, you need to kind of dilute that production as much as you can, that actinide production. So you need you're confined kind of to the trajectories where you have the most amount of high YE material. So this kind of region over here. However, the opposite is true for the Marketing calculations, right? Where you need that extra boost of actinide production with coming from the low YE material. Not only that, but you get a dependence on what your fission yields are, which makes sense because, again, you're constrained by your europium production, and this is very different depending on what your fission distribution is. However, we're able to do it, which is really exciting, and we're able to get results for our, our superactinide boost star, which is great. So with that, I will actually go ahead and conclude, and just to kind of wrap everything up. So we were able to extract effective heating and its sensitivity to beta decay rates, and found that there is indeed a sensitivity to beta decay rates, among other sources of nuclear uncertainty, including mass model and fission product distribution. We did look at how this propagated through to the light curve and whether that made a difference. We did find, again, sensitivity to beta decay rates for both the single and combined trajectory calculations. And then finally, we were able to do these nuclear chronometry calculations for a sample of 6 R-process enhanced stars. And we were actually able to get some pretty interesting and pretty good agreement. All of this and more is contained in a paper that was recently put on the archive, which I would invite you to check out if you feel so inclined. And at this point, I am happy to take any questions, if there are any.
Okay, thank you very much for the very nice talk. Let me see if there are any questions. Yes, so I think Susan has a question.
Oh, yes, if I may, I even have 2, but I'll restrain myself. My particular question, I wanted to ask about what you assume, or what's assumed in the analysis of the beta decay data set. Just minding that recently I discovered that when people talk about sterile neutrinos and nuclear reactors, typically those beta decays are analyzed in a first allowed approximation only. So I'm wondering if that similar kind of approximation is made in your beta decay data set too, because if in fact you were to work beyond that, then maybe that might impact, including like non-first allowed. I mean, what was it? 30% of the nuclear reactor database is associated with non-first allowed approximation beta decays. If that's pertinent to your analysis, that might change the long time injection of heating from the beta decay data set. So this is completely a question of curiosity. I don't have any expertise at all, except having heard said reactor neutrino talk. And so I just was curious.
That's a great question. So I will kind of preface this by saying I did not do the beta decay rate calculations myself. I took them from data sets that were previously done by other collaborators and from the literature. What I do understand of them is that I think it's going to depend on the specific calculations themselves. I believe they're going to be first forbidden. But the one thing that we do actually take into account is the beta delayed emission. And that we do from the, we use the beta strength functions calculated by Peter Muller's paper. And we do that for all 3 beta decay rates. If that, I don't,
maybe that includes some of the physics that was worried about.
It's likely. So I will say that if you were talking about, I think you mentioned high mass is where you get this effect, or did I hear that?
Oh, I was just you had analyzed for us the injection or impact on nuclear heating from beta decay, spontaneous fission, and alpha decay, and I'm just noting that if in fact, for example, if the first forbidden decays had not been included in the beta decay data set, that the effect of their emission would be, I would think, underestimating the effect of beta decay heating at long time, because you would wait a long time and then eventually you would have heating from these slower processes.
Yeah, that's
why I would say that. Yeah. That's why I would ask that. So, but at any rate, I was just injecting that thought. Thank you for the discussion. I was going to ask a question about the ages of the stars in your six stars data set, whether or not they were actually old enough to potentially, for example, if they're going out on a limb, if they're M-class stars, they might be old enough to have been subjected to more than one R-process event. So I just wanted to point that out. So
yeah, that is an interesting consideration. So the idea behind using the metal poor stars, right, is that they are indeed very old. You know, definitely not the first generation of stars, but you know, if you take metallicity to be the proxy for age, then that's consistent.
But I could imagine having differences in age in metal poor stars. I'm just, that was all I wanted to inject. So
yeah, so it's the question of whether the assumption of a single R process enrichment event is indeed a safe assumption. And I think that that's something that's generally, I don't know that you'd have a way of knowing. And you know, you're looking at the ratios ultimately, right? So whether, yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that.
okay, I just
But
wanted
that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah, because you could look at their strength in different spectral bands. You would know their color, and therefore you could have an independent assessment of how old they are, or relatively old they are.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not too sure about that. Not being an observer myself also.
It's fine. You just would look at their basically the ratio of frequency output in two different spectral bands, and then you would get their color.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that is, so I'm just saying that would be pertinent to an age assessment.
It would be an interesting way to compare, no?
Yes, I want to say that
Yeah.
maybe by selecting very old stars or very young ones, you might see less, or I would say it might change your assessment of chronometric agreement.
Mhm.
So
yeah,
thank you.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Thank you. I think George has also a question. George?
Hi, Kelsey. Hi, Kelsey. We have a seat back here. So we're all sitting.
I
in a
think
room,
one of
so
you
it's
needs to
back.
mute.
I think that's good now.
Okay.
Hi, Kelsey, and that was a
Hi.
great talk. Wonderful. Thank you. Susan asked my question. She beat me to it. But I do have a comment to add to Susan's fire. In these beta decay calculations, you know, one thing I was impressed by is that there is a heating history in these outflows, and things get a little bit hot. And you're dealing with large nuclei, and so the level density is high, and so you could think about thermally exciting states in the beta decay parent. And I'm just wondering, do you know, do these do Peter Muller's calculations, for example, do they take into account any temperature dependence? And I don't think so.
Not that I know of. So I know I don't consider, so I consider everything goes to the ground state. It's just a kind of simple Q-value calculation.
Yeah,
I don't have any
sure that
excited
Peter Muller's
states.
calculations just go from the ground state.
Yeah.
But this just you know, kind of adds to Susan's point. I would think that in some cases the thermally excited states might have very short beta half-lives in some cases.
Yeah, so you can definitely get
worth
some more complex beta decay heating structure.
Yeah. I mean, just to add to Susan's point that there may be other contributions to the weak decay rates that accelerate things a bit.
Yeah,
and
I think a lot of this highlights really just how much uncertainty from the nuclear physics there is, and how important it is to kind of try to bring that uncertainty down as much as we can.
And my second question was really I guess the final point is that you could find a consistent initial YE, right, that would fit all the chronometers, you know, consistently for all those stars.
Possibly.
And I
so
kind of
it's not just the YE.
No, I know, but
okay.
My question is that when you find the best fit, that it's remarkable actually that it actually worked, Kelsey. It's pretty amazing. You know, that you found something consistent that would match that would match that for all those stars. Okay, great. What does that tell you about that initial, if you take it to be 1R process event, what does it tell you for what the initial YE in that R process event was?
So that's a kind of difficult question, right? Because it depends on what nuclear physics you're using. So yes, we were, if I go back to this, we're able to get something for each of the stars, but what beta decay rate you're using and what your fission deposition looks like changes what you actually expect that combination of trajectories to be, or what your distribution of material to actually be. And so it's a little bit complicated. Now here I will say that, this is a limited set of trajectories, right? So this is just kind of to I don't know words now, but to get a broad look at things. It would probably be a good idea to possibly weigh towards higher YE even more, and instead of having these kind of this double peak here, you change the proportions a little bit. And so yes, that would be a very interesting thing to look at, I think.
Okay, so if it is higher YE, I mean, is there less fission cycling that goes on then?
So the way that we've constructed it here is you always have some component of material from this low YE. So you're always getting some contribution from, fissioned material. Okay. Likewise, you always have some contribution of high YE. So you always have some kind of like a dilution effect. And so these are just things to take into consideration when you're, looking at this. I will also say, I did forget to mention that here, this, where I have results for the N3AS beta decay rates, that actually corresponds exactly to the same things that we get from the Muller calculations. I didn't show them here because they exactly overlap, but with these two stars, with the Kodama fission distribution, you're able to get results for all of the trajectories for both of those sets of beta decay rates, and you're limited by what you can predict from the Marketing. So it depends. It depends on the actinide content of your star, on the nuclear physics that's going into your calculations, and how much of different YE material you have.
Very good. Thanks, Kelsey.
Okay, thanks. Oops. Okay, I think now we are muted. So Sherwood also has a question.
Oh, hi.
Hi, good to see you. Thanks for the great talk. So it's interesting to see just in terms of the light curves, how different things can be from different assumptions on the nuclear physics. But I'm of course also curious about there's significant modeling uncertainties, and I don't know if you've gotten any kind of good grasp on like how the relative contributions to uncertainties weigh against each other, and whether there's like different phases of the light curve that are more sensitive to nuclear physics or more sensitive to models.
So are you talking about like from like hydro simulations? Yeah,
like how much mass is ejected, when is it ejected, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I will say that this particular light curve calculation is kind of just to get an idea or a handle on the uncertainties. It's not very detailed, so it doesn't account for possible mixing. It doesn't really. Yeah, it's just kind of, this is the heating, let's propagate it through, to something that resembles a light curve. We take into account a temperature dependent opacity. So, I mean, yes, in theory, you would be dependent on the composition at a certain point in time. We kind of get around that by doing this temperature dependent treatment. And so we're able to get, something of a description of the opacity, but that's kind of it. So it is kind of a toy model. It's meant to really just show the uncertainty from the nuclear physics. But it is true that adding in all of the complexities that go into the actual light curve itself, including, atomic line opacities, neutrino effects, like all of this stuff would just complicate it a lot, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking that, maybe there's like I don't know how well this works, but like the late part of the light curve is dominated by the early part of the ejection, because it's the more neutron rich heavy element stuff. And so maybe, there's different dependencies on the nuclear physics there than in the early blue component. But yeah, I mean, yeah, so that's good, thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say, this kind of light curve, when we talk about this light curve that I'm doing, this is kind of the red component. This is the high opacity. Where did I go there? There we go. That is kind of focused on that component of it.
Okay. Okay.
And so when when you see these kind of extensions and, these different shapes and everything, these are from different effects from the different like nuclei that are involved. I actually have whole tables of it, and I look at these differences on a more so I mentioned that the width of these comes from the use of different mouse models. I actually kind of take a closer look at it. This is all in the paper. And we pick out individual nuclei and everything. So yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me see chat if there are any more questions here. No. So if there are no more questions, then thank you very much, Kelsey, for the very nice talk.
And thank you.
Yeah, and we will see you all in 2 weeks for the next N3AS seminar.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yes.
Thanks. Bye.